Hello, my name is Nigel. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Essex. And for some years I've been working on what has been called a green criminology. In this short talk I'll try to do two things which I hope might be of interest. First, give a sense of where an idea, in this case thinking about greening criminology, comes from, and second, say something about what we mean by green criminology, and also how it's developed and what it encompasses. I think the first part is important for any teaching about theories or concepts, but is often neglected, and this is understandable. Often when we're in the classroom, we don't have time, and the main focus is what the idea or concept or theory is about. But there is a context to the emergence of our social thinking and attempts to add new directions to the field. And in other words, there is a story. So, my story. For a series of undergraduate lectures in 1996, I was presenting a sweep across what were then several new horizons in criminology, such as feminism, postmodernism, and comparative approaches to criminology. And I was thinking what else could be added as we approached the end of the century. So, based upon a combination of interests, first in public health, I've been quite involved in teaching about health for some years, often to health professionals. Second, an interest in corporate crime, which was a key criminological topic, but often I felt rather narrowly defined and narrowly applied. And third, a personal interest in nature and the environment. Combining all of these led me to think of the idea of adding a lecture on a green criminology. The lecture was able to draw upon a recently published paper sent to me by an American criminologist called Piers Byrne, with whom I had started to correspond. And at this point, young people might want to pause and consider how hard it was to share work, ideas, papers, and so on with colleagues before the internet and email, when, for example, transatlantic letters took around a week to arrive. Anyway, the correspondence with Piers led to a collaboration and co-editing a special issue of a journal called Theoretical Criminology, which was published in 1998. So my lecture became an article, A Green Field for Criminology, with a question mark at the end, and argued for the enhancement of environmental awareness and consciousness in criminology and the development of a green perspective. To take the proposal forward, I set out 4 questions arising from the title. First, why a green criminology? Second, what kinds of existing work might this build upon? Third, what theoretical issues are opened up? And finally, what directions might a green criminology pursue? I was arguing that the arrival of the environmental agenda in criminology was way overdue, because engagement with green issues was much more advanced in many other fields of study. It was certainly the case in sociology, but also across the wider social and the natural sciences, of course, but also in humanities. So what kinds of work might this build upon? As I say, very importantly, a green criminology did not just appear. There were precedents, there were antecedents, and there had been many past studies which had examined examples of environmental damage, crime, and victimization. For example, on organized crime and waste disposal, on corporations that were responsible for pollution, and various other similar studies. But these were not unified by any shared agenda or concern about environmental matters. What theoretical issues are opened up? I suggested the idea of a green perspective rather than theory, in the same way that Ken Plummer, writing in 1979, had argued that labelling should be seen not as a single theory, which it isn't, but as a perspective. And in this way, Plummer said it would be able to harbour several diverse theoretical positions. And I thought that this should apply to the idea of a green conceptual space or category for use within criminology. So as a perspective, it could be associated with any number of theoretical positions and schools, and that is what has occurred. I thought a green perspective should also be more than a theory and be more of a practical and applied approach that would make connections and engage with others concerned about the state of the environment. So possible collaborations could occur with international law enforcement bodies, those that were concerned particularly with environmental harms and crimes, and some scholars have engaged with Interpol and other policing agencies. It could engage with the articulation of environmental and human rights, as well as the work of NGOs, non-governmental organisations. Many NGOs provide important examples of animal welfare work, environmental advocacy, and other kinds of work relevant to criminology and associated interests. I also suggested that criminology should be interested in the link between political protest to preserve human rights today and the action required to preserve the environmental rights of future generations. So this point would be relevant to groups like Extinction Rebellion and similar protest movements. I should say something about influences and convergences. I didn't invent a green criminology, and in fact, the first published essay on the topic, called The Greening of Criminology, was by an American criminologist, Mike Lynch, and that was published in 1990. But it was published in a limited circulation newsletter in North America, which meant that it did not reach a very wide audience at the time or for some time after that. So I and many others outside the United States and Canada didn't see it for many, many years. And again, it's worth noting how much harder it was to circulate ideas before the internet. And in fact, there were even earlier statements about the need for criminology and the sociology of deviance to be more focused on environmental crime. These were made, for example, by a Slovenian criminologist, Pecha, and there was also a pioneering conference in France in, I think, the 1970s, but with no English language translation, and again, pre-internet, these were not picked up and well known internationally. I would argue that a green criminology emerged and developed in the 1990s because it was inevitable and it was necessary. It reflected scientific interests and political challenges of the moment. It carried forward the momentum of critical criminology and enabled people to come together. It provided a point of contact and convergence for academics and others, coming together around shared interests and the feeling that the environment needed to be a subject of study. So I don't think anyone in particular can be credited as the originator, because the development of a green or eco-criminology was being explored by many other researchers in many other places for very similar reasons, all at the same time. For example, Ragnhild Soland in Norway, Rob White in Australia, and others elsewhere. In terms of concepts, importantly, green criminology considers and emphasises environmental harm, as well as crime. So it's not just a matter of whether an action or event should be a crime in law, but it also considers actions and events that are harmful. And this connects to the more recent idea of semiology. Green criminology addresses the classic criminological questions of how to deal with, first, harmful actions that are not criminalised but arguably should be. And second, with actions that do break laws or regulations, but which do not receive effective or rigorous responses. It's concerned with crimes and harms affecting human and non-human life, affecting ecosystems and the biosphere, affecting the planet. A green criminological perspective is broad, and it includes various theoretical, methodological, and eco-philosophical orientations. And once you start to think about it, the range of vital issues covered by green criminology is enormous, from air and water pollution to waste accumulation and toxicity, the state of the oceans and plastic pollution, crime and harm affecting non-human species, cruelty, abuse, extinction, and the causes and consequences of global warming and climate change. A green criminology can help us to think about causes of various forms of environmental damage and responses to harmful actions, as well as inactions. In other words, responses that should be happening but are not, and representations of environmental crime and harm. Just think how many TV programs and films and media reports now have an environmental disaster or danger at the centre of the report or the plot or the unfolding story. The green criminology is also interested in alternatives to criminal justice, such as shaming and restorative justice approaches, or the use of specialist environmental courts to bring new expertise to environmental cases. Green criminology has drawn on theories of risk society, the work of Ulrich Beck, and on globalization in thinking about the escalation of environmental harms as risks and consequences of modernity and transnational production and reproduction. And for some of us, Brisbane and I, one of the main problems we face is consumer culture and its cycle of demand and disposal. So our book on a green cultural criminology draws on work on cultures of consumption. Another key concept that has become important in green criminology is ecocide, and this concerns the accelerating exploitation of the earth, and consequent exhaustion of resources and damage to the planet. This concept has been around since the 1970s, but was given an international high profile by the campaigning work of the barrister Polly Higgins, who sadly died not too long ago. Perhaps the main ecocidal and arguably suicidal threat we are creating at the moment is climate change and related global warming and other consequences. Sociologists and criminologists have suggested that climate change will stimulate a number of deeply criminogenic forces. The American criminologist and sociologist Robert Agnew, for example, has examined linkages between climate change and crime in terms of old and classic theories such as strain and social control, but warns of new crimes and challenges as climate change creates new reasons for individuals to commit crime. Others, such as Ron Kramer, argue that climate change constitutes a state corporate crime. So green criminology is new, but it also links to and builds on long-standing and classic sociological and criminological theories. Green criminology is still evolving. There's lots of new work coming out regularly, It's making connections with other academic disciplines. It has proved to be applied, working with governmental and non-governmental organisations. And future directions will probably elaborate on studies of the relationship between environment and culture and environment and conflict, as well as the exploitation of nature and links to human rights. This is particularly important in relation to the Global South, and this links to the new subfield of Southern criminology. Some of my own work is now focused on indigenous peoples in Latin America who live in ways deeply entwined with nature. And the destruction or exploitation of the environment they live in raises many questions about rights and who has rights. Why do our consumer demands in the global north need to be met by destroying the livelihoods and homes of others in the global south? What will be the impact on climate change of our continuing harvesting and destruction of ancient forests and wild places? And what should we be doing to stop the extinction of other humans as well as endangered wildlife? Criminology and sociology need to maintain awareness of new directions in, for example, biosciences and nanotechnology, as well as pay attention to the legacy of technologies, such as the challenges of disposal of toxic waste and plastics. And of course, this kind of observation could not be more obvious at the moment. Think about the COVID pandemic today. It's a health problem, and as the challenges of preventing infection show us, it is also a social order and social control problem. This is a very sociological issue. But the origin of the virus is, as far as we know, associated with crowded conditions in a wildlife market or similar circumstances, in which the virus jumped from other non-human species to humans. This is called zoonotic transmission. It has happened before, for example with Ebola and SARS, and the continuing deforestation of the planet will mean it will happen again. This will happen as we humans continue to push into territory and disturb local ecosystems that will include viruses that reproduce in a mild form among animals in undisturbed habitats, but that take the opportunity to mutate when they come into contact with humans. I think this is an area where we could see useful work in the future being done by green criminology and public health specialists together. Overall, I think the term green criminology has been useful and has stimulated a great deal of work. Some researchers prefer to use other terminology such as conservation criminology or eco-global criminology. These are all helpful descriptions of important work, and this work must go on. These are challenges that face us and the planet, and they are urgent. To my mind, what matters is simply that criminology continues to engage with these concerns.